This is the third tape in a series of Nobler construction tapes, and we're about at the point where we're carving the inboard wingtip. For anybody who hasn't seen the first two, this is the third one we've made so far during the construction. And they basically show building of an old Aldrich Nobler from a kit, which you probably could do the same as building by plans. Really wouldn't matter. Trying to do this to help out some of the advanced level flyers, beginners, intermediates that might be building a Nobler type of ship. Maybe there's even some experts out there that could benefit from some of these tips. Everybody I've ever met has something to add to the hobby, something to add to personal ideas, things he can add to this. Everybody seems to have some unique little ideas and ways of doing things. Now, mine aren't really unique, these are just tried and true methods. We're trying to build this Nobler with a lot of old-fashioned construction techniques and yet make it an updated Nobler, make it as competitive as possible. I'd like to fly this in the Circle Burn, a Fox 35 event. Next year. We're obviously not going to be done for this year's contest. And we're roughing out this inboard tip. I'm going to try to go through the steps of cutting the wingtips out, making a little slider for it. So I'll finish, basically I'm going to finish carving this tip out right now. Remove most of the material that you don't need right away. And then the next step is going to be, we'll take it outside, or maybe we'll do it down here, we can get it on camera. Hollow it out with the Dremel tool. Put in a little slider, much like a Bobby Hunt type of slider from years ago, so we can make little adjustments to the lead outs. Just get the tip rough shaped out here. Now I got tape on the inboard tip. Tape around the wood so I can't gouge into it, hopefully. Everything looks pretty good so far. Alright, there's no point putting too much of this on footage. We'll finish carving this out and then we'll pick this up at the point we split it apart off the tip. Now what we did so far, we have the tip hollowed out, rough shaped, completely hollowed out inside, of course split apart and hollowed out. And we're going to build in a little bit of mechanism in here, a little Bobby Hunt type of slider for this Nobler. This is the first part of the slider that's going to go inside the tip when it's finished. And we're going to make up two little blocks with eyelets and set screws on this next. I roughed out the parts of the slider on a piece of 16th plywood. Drill 2 holes, connect it with an X-Acto blade and try to sand it out. Here's the little slider we made up for the Nobler. If you could buy one of the pre-made ones, it'd be a lot easier. But right now, we don't have one right in the shop here, so we got to make this up. 16th and 1/8 inch plywood, a little eyelet, 632. Well, what do we use? 348 blind nuts. 348 sliding screw. Now that'll adjust. Anybody doesn't know how that works. You loosen a screw through the wingtip slot, and that'll loosen up pretty much like that. Of course, we'll have one for the up line, one for the down line. We can move the lead outs independently then, each one separate. And what we'll do is we'll glue this into the wingtip. Try to get it all centered up, lined up nice. Now we got some hot stuff down in there.
What happens, and this happens a lot when you hot stuff blind nuts in, is you get a little bit of hot stuff down in the threads. And usually I have a tap. Oh, you heard this. And when that happens, if you just take and run a little tap down into the blind nut, you can get most of it out. Now this one is really clogged up good. I wanted to be sure those blind nuts weren't going to come jumping out of there. Nice to have a tap handle. I don't have a tap handle right here. Now if you don't get any hot stuff down in there, of course you don't have to do this. 3/48 screws are nice for this particular job. They're nice and light. You can make this out of little Delrin blocks too. That's okay. This way just happens to be something I have in the shop. It'll probably be just as light as the Delrin, if maybe a little lighter even. Okay, we got the threads cleaned out. Now that'll happen all the time. It happens every time I do something. I always get a little bit of hot stuff down in the threads and you have to rethread the whole, retap it. You can get a set of cheap taps for about $1.50 a piece in a hardware store. They'll be handy to have. Should have them. Should have them in your toolbox too. When you get down a field and something gets gopped up, you can fix it right on the spot. Alright. My next step is going to glue this permanently into the outboard tip. Glue the outboard tip on. And then final sand it all in. Final sand that wing out before we go on to the next step. Okay, and obviously we can slide these back and forth. We got nice little brass eyelets in there. It's a nice little setup. Just put a drop of hot stuff in there so you can see how that looks. And how it looks from out here. It'll be recessed in just a little bit. I'll try to line this with a little bit of hot stuff so it doesn't get too delicate to the touch while we're working on this. You can kind of press that plywood in. That's a nice light setup. Now I'll put some hot stuff in along here, try to seal that up later. I guess we can put that together permanently now. And get a nice finish on this before we put it back on the wing and blend it in.
finalizing the fit on the wingtips, any rounded surface. Good old piece of foam. You can save your foam cradles and cut them up. Now, because the wing frame has one coat of clear on it, the wood is nice and stiff, and I can get a nice blend on this wingtip without a lot of problem. If that wing didn't have any clear, this would be a little bit harder. Okay. Now the last step in this wingtip is going to be to a little bit of dap on this. This is regular dap vinyl paste. A little saliva on your finger and get it rubbed down into the groove. This sand's real easy, and after this dries we can get some clear dope on this and harden up the wood. This looks like it come out real nice. Stuff comes right off your hands with water and soap, so there's no problem. You run out of fingertips here to mush this stuff in. I got the other end of this wrapped up in a shirt, so it'll kind of, okay, you want to get a little extra in the front. A little bit of a gap in the front we want to fill in. Like I said, I like to fill in the joints and the little bad spots as I go along. If you do that, then you get to the end of the plane and you're almost done. You don't have to spend a whole night doing that. Okay, I'm going to bend up the lead outs and then put this wing aside to dry. Looks like we're in real good shape here as far as having this done. We're one day away from covering this. Okay, I bent up the lead out ends. This just keeps you from poking your eye out, bending them up on construction. I like to put a little piece of tubing around the end of it. Stay Bright silver solder is probably the best solder for anything, any kind of soldering job you have on a plane. Real nice stuff to work with. Halfway decent soldering iron's not a bad idea either. Anytime you're done soldering, next thing you should do is let it cool. Never cool it real fast with either alcohol or whatever. Let it cool down by itself. Then get some alcohol and a Q-tips, alcohol and a paper towel. And I always like to burnish off some of the material that's on there because it's usually oxidized. So a good idea is just take some 400 sandpaper or whatever and clean the joint up. That's usually a pretty good idea. Okay, that should have been cleaned up enough.
been cooling down for a few minutes while we're off camera. This is just regular old alcohol. Important to get all that flux off as much as you can. What I like to do is get even some sandpaper on there and clean that off. Real important to get the junk off of these solder joints when you're done. Especially when you're using Stay Bright. That's real sulfuric acid in that flux. It's a nice little trick, them little pieces of tubing on the wire. That's a nice little effect. It's a nice joint, real good. And these lead outs are all polished up now, cleaned up with alcohol. As we buff the plane out, we'll even buff them out a little bit, get a nice finish on them. Now this is how much progress we have on the Nobler so far. We got the stab covered with most of the clear on it. Body's built, the tank and engine are pretty much installed, the gear installed. Wing is ready for a couple of final sandings and clear. Hinges, flaps, and controls, and then be covered. And we're going to leave this project for today. Alright, we're back down here. Now one of the things that's good to have, this is foam rubber pad that comes under carpeting. You can usually get this for free on garbage day if you look for somebody throwing out a rug. Or you can go to a carpet store and buy a couple yards of it. Now the idea of this is when you're sanding out the wing, I'm going to do the final sanding on this wing. I got all my little bad spots around the edges where I dapped it in. And I want to do the final sanding in. Now the purpose of this carpet is you don't put 1,000 little dings in this by the time you get it done. You put it in your lap, it rubs on your belt buckle, your watch, your ring, whatever. It's a good idea not to wear watches and rings when you do the final sanding out anyway. And this carpet pad is really handy for doing this kind of work. This really does make it pleasant to work. What's good to have when you're going to do a final sanding out, again, is a foam block, piece of a wing core, ring saddle, that is, piece of hard balsa for doing the actual final trimming. Probably some 320 paper for this. This is pretty well sanded out already. It's not in bad shape. I'll get me a piece of 320 here. And this pad really makes, whether you put a piece of this in your lap or you put a piece of it wherever. Now this you can see I'm just gonna knock down all the edges that I put DAP on yesterday. DAP goes right away, just like balsa would. Then I think what I'll do with this is put on a nice coat of clear dope, stiffen this up, and then work on the horn and the flaps today. Carpet pad is a good trick though. Should have plenty of that around. If you go around on the day after it rains in an area like Little Ferry, about half of the houses have a nice big chunk of carpet pad outside with carpeting. And when you get down to the final, actually doing the final finish on this, you can put your whole plane up here, put 2 or 3 layers of that carpet pad on. That'll be real handy. You won't be ginging it all up. The other thing that's handy is to have one of those chairs. If you like working standing up, I like standing up when I work. Most of the time, once the plane turns into an airplane from component parts, it really makes it handy to work on. Alright, so I'm going to finish all the sanding out on the whole wing, blocking it out with 320. Then I'm going to put a coat of clear dope on this. A real handy little tool here is a piece of 16 plywood with a piece of sandpaper glued to it. You can get in there and clean out those adjustable lead-out guides. Now I just had a problem off camera with this. As I dropped, from gluing on a wingtip, I dropped some hot stuff down on the adjustable lead-out guide. So I'll make a suggestion that you check that adjustable lead-out guide a few times during construction. If it doesn't get some dope on it, some glue, something that's going to restrict it, you go to fly the plane the first time and you go to adjust the lead-outs, you can have a real problem. Unnecessary problem too. I'm just putting the final detail sanding on, trying to round these edges off. This little piece of sandpaper on here is real handy. Now this is real vulnerable until we get some clear dope on it. The slightest little thing touches this and we got a gouge. What I'm doing now is putting a little bit of hot stuff, since this wood by the wingtip is real vulnerable, gets real delicate. Put a little hot stuff, this thin hot stuff, right out on the tip. Keep that from getting too vulnerable. Let it kick off by itself nice and slow. That'll kind of protect that a little bit while we're working on it. With that CA on the end of this wingtip, this wood is nice and stiff. We can get a nice, kind of a nice finish on it. Be a little less vulnerable to dings during the next construction phases. Carpet padding's coming in real handy now. Getting real comfortable to work on this. You can work on it sitting down or standing up with this setup. In the area of the plane, and probably the cowling's another good spot, the wingtips, the edges of the flaps, where you feel the wood is vulnerable while you're working on it, it's a real good idea to use some of that CA in there. Or at best, just get a couple coats of dope on there as soon as possible. Stiffen up the wood. Make it a little less vulnerable to little dings and dings. And of course, no matter how careful you are, you always get a few. Again, maybe the basic idea, the biggest idea of these tapes is to just give you some ideas. Just give you a little insight, some ideas on developing some new techniques of your own. Because these certainly isn't the last word. I'm sure everybody has some little special ideas that work real good. Now what I'll do with that tip, do is get some dope on this now, because we're going to start working on the other wingtip now. I'm going to get this. This will stiffen it up just enough. Every time it touches something, it's not going to get a little gouge in it. Always like to have a nice little clean area where the lead outs come out of the wing. I hate to see that get all chewed up right away. So we're going to go over, as soon as we finish doing this, we'll go over and get that other tip sanded out. There's a lot of little touch-up spots left before I start in on the flaps. But probably from this point on, we'll keep the carpet padding out on the table. Protect this a little bit. Alright, we'll do the rest of this off camera. And next step is going to be making up a little horn. Needless to say, we want to have bushings. First thing we want to check on this horn, we want to make sure that when you make the horn that it's absolutely 90 degrees, or else you're going to have exponential controls. You want to make sure that both of the arms are parallel. And we want to have it as short as possible, so what we're going to do is embed it the same way we did on the elevator horn. We're going to embed it right in the end of the flap horn. Remember, double check everything that it's 90 degrees. We're going to go put bushings in this right now. This one looks pretty good. The next step's going to be, we're going to machine this out for bushings. Now what works good on bushings is little eyelets. Little eyelets with washers soldered on both sides. I'm going to clean this up with sandpaper before we use it. Anything you solder should be pretty clean. Pretty much making a duplicate of the horn we made on the tail, if you've watched that tape already. You want to have a little brass bushing in here, so a lot of real good planes wore out before their day, and usually the first thing that wears out is the controls. Takes a couple of minutes to put a brass eyelet in there and you're all set. A nice way to bush horns is drill it out for these little eyelets. The eyelets are brass, of course. An 1/8 inch drill gives you a nice press fit. You get a nice ready-made bushing. You can kind of get a nice press fit in there too when you do this. Try to get them lined up parallel to the horn. Okay. Now one of the things that's real handy is this little vise. You can buy for a couple bucks, or you can make your own. It has a little alligator clip. It's real handy for holding stuff while you solder it. Again, we're using Stay Bright solder. I put a little washer on the end of each eyelet. Give me a little more bearing surface here. Needless to say, the important thing here is Get it nice and clean. The little vise will do a nice job of holding it. Remember, anytime you use Stay Bright solder, let it cool off by itself. Wipe it down with alcohol or baking soda. And we'll trim them eyelets off. Stay Bright solder is the only kind of solder you want to use on any of these modeling projects. It's really the best you can buy. Here we use an alcohol to clean this up. Get all that flux off of there. Otherwise you're going to have yourself one rusty horn at the end of the season. Get it as clean as possible. Okay, you can trim off trim off the ends on that. You want to be real nice and neat. We ground down those bushings a little bit. Get the final little bit of flux off of there. Clean the rest of that up. A little piece of sandpaper and try to get all the burrs and sharp edges off. I like to have no sharp edges on any of this. Sharp edges are where things start to crack and break. I have lost a plane because of horn failure already too, so I've gotten real cautious about not letting the horn rust and rot away. 4 or 5 years later, this thing becomes a rusted hulk. Looks like a sewer pipe. Okay, now we're going to make up a little brace in there, just like we did on a tail horn. We've got plenty of bearing material there. Should be a nice little setup. Now it also pays, you can run a little drill right through there. Let's see, we got a 3/32 drill here. Go over on a drill press and run that drill through a few times. Because you will get solder in those bushings. We'll do this on a drill press, it'll be a lot more efficient. Radius those corners with a little countersink, and that'll be a nice little horn. And I'm going to make up some little bushings. Let me get the sharp scissors, these are Johnson. You get a pair of these tin snips, they're handy to have around the house. Needless to say, when you buy the 398 ones, they last about that long. You buy a good pair of these, they'll probably last forever. Okay, I want to make a little retainer for this. And this will get shoved into the trailing edge, hot stuffed, with a little bead of epoxy around it maybe, something to hold it in nice and solid. We don't want this guy moving around, jumping around at all. That'll work good. I want this to be tight, but obviously not so tight that you bind up the horn. Okay, if you make it too tight, squeeze it from the back. Okay, that's about perfect. Now because that middle of the wing is already sheeted, we got to be able to get this in there nice and straight and tight right on the first shot. We don't want to have it left over. Now I take a box and I save all the little copper scraps, brass scraps, tubing, everything. Somewhere down the road you wind up using it. Save a little money by doing it that way. You have to run out and buy new stuff all the time. Okay, again, we don't want it too tight. When you do squeeze it and it's too tight, squeeze it from the back. That'll loosen it up for you. Get it so it's just nice and tight without being, really able to spin that without being too loose. Sometimes you have to fool with it a little bit to get it just about right, which we're doing right now. Okay, once that has a little oil on it, that'll be nice. Okay, we've got that. Can clip the corners. I'll make putting it into the trailing edge a little easier. We'll chew everything all up. Now we're going to glue the horn to the back of the wing as the first step, and then carve up the flaps. That'll be our next step. And a little silly thing I want to cut. These shears are getting old too. Maybe it's time for a new set of shears. Heaven forbid we should have to spend some money here. Okay, that's standard procedure. And obviously all these little techniques can be used on any plane you're building. Building a plane without these horn bushings ensures you'll never have any reasonably good control. Okay, this will get shoved into the back of the flap, glued in, and we'll be ready. Alright, what we did, we have the horn mounted on the back of the flaps now, and the back of the wing. Okay, this is a good product when you want to oil the pins or hinges. You can buy this in motorcycle shops for about $3. I put some on the horn before I press the brass around it. This keeps it nice and loose, the hot stuff doesn't get in there. I also make these little pieces of 64th plywood for braces. You can see I have little braces so that horn is in there nice and tight, top and bottom. Got a little brace on it. Nice and solid in that trailing edge area. And I also would like to run a little bead of hot stuff, I use the thin stuff, up around the sheeting, stiffen that up. Okay, next thing we're going to try to do is we're going to want to bend this push rod. Might have to open up that hole in the sheeting a little bit. Get some of the hot stuff off of there. Okay, now the way I usually do this, it's a nice easy way to do this, I try to mark the midway point of the controls. I want to have the midway point on the controls marked on the belt crank through. I want to have this in neutral. I want this on this side. Okay, and I usually mark that up with a piece of tape. Let's get a little piece of tape on that. And I'll try to line this up so it's in neutral. You have to kind of figure this out in your mind. You have to interpolate it. Now I can see this is going to have to get opened up a little bit more. So I may as well do this right now. I got a little piece of tape marking that. Try to line this up. And I'm going to have to cut a piece off of this tape. Now when I get that piece of tape where it's in the middle of the throw, I'll bend the push rod. Cut a little bit more of that tape off. Once you have the tape right at the midpoint, you can go ahead and bend the push rod. It's handy to have vice grips. Now I needed my vice grips the other day and I couldn't find them, so I'm probably going to have to do this with 2 pair of pliers. You also want to get that push rod bend on a 90-degree angle, if at all possible. Okay, we got the same amount front and back. Okay. Okay, we got our 90-degree bend in this wire. I want to trim off the excess wire now. Now usually you have to deburr this wire a little bit before you get it in there. Let's see if this will go in without deburring too much. Now it's real important to have these push rods with absolutely no extra bends in them. You want a straight line from the bell crank to the horn, no extra little kinks and steps and things like that. One straight line is what you're looking for. That is a nice tight fit. Alright, next thing we're going to set up for is to do the washer, solder the washer on there. Anybody that doesn't know about these little Walters washers, these little washers, I'll hold the pack up, you can order them from Walters, they make HO train stuff. They're 256 washers. The part number is 947-1273, brass washers. These exactly fit over a 3/32 wire. You just run a drill through them and it's a super nice tight fit. Now the idea of a super nice tight fit is that the solder doesn't run under it and solder your push rod to the control system, which happens. If you've never used these little washers, you're in for a real treat. They really work nice. They fit nice and tight. Now I already have the washer on there. I also have, more importantly than that, is I ground a little notch in the end of the wire and I wrap a little piece of copper wire around it as a double safety check system on this. I obviously don't want this washer coming off in flight or from vibration or whatever. I twist on that little piece of wire and that acts as a little keeper also in addition to the solder. It's a double backup system. Now that's worked real well over the years. Again, most important single thing when you do this push rod deal is no bends in the push rod. All the bends should be radiused. Any bend that you have going from the bell crank to the push rod should have a little radius in it so you don't have a tendency for the wire to crack. You put a real sharp bend in music wire and when you bend it back it'll usually crack. Again, we're going to use Stay Bright solder on this washer. I took the reamer and reamed out the inside of the bushing so that the bushing and the radius on the wire match up real nice. That'll make for a control system that'll last a little longer than normal. This is something you can do on every ship you make. There's a little notch in the wire, of course. Those little Walter washers, they are super nice little items. Again, don't try to cool this too fast. Get a nice bead of solder. I also put the push rods all facing out of the circle. I don't like to have the push rods facing in. If the push rods are facing out and you have a little problem with the washer, centrifugal force will usually leave the push rod in place, hopefully, until you can land the plane. The washer jumps off. If you bend them the other way, centrifugal force pulls the push rod out of the horn, and bango, that's it. Day's end. Again, I like to clean this up with alcohol. I use these little tape cleaning pads that have alcohol in them. Alcohol and Freon. They're good for wiping solid lines too. I have no idea where to buy them. I used to borrow them from work. Now that I don't work, I can't borrow them, so when these are gone, I'm going to have to come up with another system. Now I've got a little notch in the end of the wire. Wrap the copper wire through the notch. The washer fits real tight up against the horn. We got the good old PJ1 out. Put a drop of that on here. We can also put a drop on a horn. It wouldn't hurt right now. This way the dope won't stick to the bushing. Any you get on a wood, the alcohol will take right off. And the next thing we're going to try to do is make up some flaps. Now we already cut these out of quarter grain wood. The most important thing about making a flap is to get the grain of the wood running with the trailing edge. Quarter grain wood is definitely your first choice. Most people like to put the grain running with the hinge line, and it results in a warped flap. Try to get the grain, the edge of the wood running with the end of the flap, not the hinge line. The exact opposite of probably the way you've been doing it. Now by doing that, you're going to accomplish two things. You'll definitely get the flap to come out straighter, but you can also thin out the back of the flap more and keep it from warping up. So what I'm going to do, first step on any flap is to get a center line right down the whole flap. Now there's a lot of excellent ways of making flaps. You can do it like they do in a Magnum kit where there's tubing glued to the table. There's a lot of good ways. You can do it with a sanding block, but I'm going to try to use the old traditional method of just putting a center line on the whole flap and hacking it out with a razor plane, sanding it straight. And this is kind of the way it used to be done years ago, except for the fact we had cloth hinges. Okay, and I'm going to embed the horn in the end of the flap almost the same way as we did with the elevators and stab. So most important thing is get yourself a center line right down the whole flap, because you're going to use that. And you sure don't want to get the tip of the flap paper thin. That's a mistake too. Getting it too thin is no good. About 1/8 of an inch radius is just about nice. Okay, the edges of this will be rounded off, so it really won't matter. And when you get used to working with wood, wood is a nice thing to work with. It can be frustrating if you go about it in the wrong way. But if you get used to working with wood, it can get to be your friend. Again, the main thing is to get center lines on everything. If you don't have center lines to work from, you're really building in the dark. You're really going to have problems somewhere later on in the program. I can't imagine how you could build this straight without center lines on everything. Again, the reason for quarter grain wood is it has less of a tendency to buckle up when you put a coat of dope on it, and you probably can make it even thinner. Flaps are another one of those areas where you shouldn't just reach into the pile and grab out the two lightest pieces of wood you have. You should look for straight wood. You should try to get straight wood, center line it all around before you even start working with it. For sure. For sure you don't want to just grab the two lightest pieces. Now the next thing we're going to do is get our hinge line on here straight with the tape, the same way we did it on the other piece. And this time we'll use 1/8 inch tape because we're only using 1/4 inch wood. So I'll do these one at a time. I'm going to lay out, I hope you can see this, I'm going to lay out a piece of tape on what's amounting to be the hinge line. This is regular old 3M 1/8 inch tape. Nothing special here. Try to get it nice and straight. This will allow you to put the first step being to put the V on one end of the wood. First I lay out a piece of 1/8 inch. Then I lay out a second piece right behind it, and then pull off the first piece, and you'll be exactly 1/8 of an inch from the wood. But the way I usually gauge this is half the thickness. In other words, on 1/2 inch, the elevators were 1/2 inch, so I used 1/4 inch tape. These are 1/4 inch, so I'm using 1/8 inch. That'll usually give you a good reference line. Now you've got a nice reference line on there.
and a center line, which you can work with. Again, repeat the whole thing on the back. You can probably use the same piece of tape over. Find some ways of economizing on this when there isn't a lot of money available. You'll figure it out yourself. Okay. Most of the planes I build have wood flaps. All the BJs, the LJs all had solid wood flaps. No foam. You can do a nice job with foam, but it's a little more work intensive. You probably can make it a little tad lighter, but it sure won't be as strong as it will be if it's solid wood. My guess is it's stronger when it's like that. Now I'll take out the old big blade and just get some of that off. Now I'm using a center line and a tape. And I can probably, if I'm real careful and if I got a new blade, I can do this in one piece. You can actually feel the tape. If you run into the tape, you'll feel, whoops, you're going too far. Oops, I just did. Going a little bit too far. So just back off a little bit. Okay. Alright, we got it off in one piece. Okay, we'll do the same thing on the other side. Now remember, you're not going, in days gone by you might have done this and the grain was running right parallel to the old hinge line, so it was a little easier. You saw we didn't get it in one piece. It was a little easier in that respect. This respect's a little harder to carve this, but the part you really care about is the end, and that's going to have the grain dead parallel. That in itself is a tip worth remembering on elevators, rudders, anything you want to stay straight. The reason kit manufacturers probably cut parts out the other way, it's just easier to cut them out. They can use one side of the wood for a line, but remembering that, that's an important step. They could take out the old razor plane, which I assume you can still buy these. Screw that up. Just run it once, it'll probably be plenty. It'll get off the high spots. Okay, and get out the old sanding block. You want to go right up to the ink line, but not through it. And you'll actually feel when you come to the tape. There's no secret here. When you come to the tape, you'll know it. You actually feel it as you're sanding it in. You can use that actually for a guide. Run right up to it. Leave that center line on. As soon as you see the center line disappearing, you know you went too far. Okay, we'll do the same thing up at this end. No matter what kind of plane you build, whether it's a Banshee or a Sig Chipmunk or a Nobler or whatever, this is one technique you're going to have to learn. You get nice straight flaps, and it's not a big deal. Relatively easy. Somebody shows you how to do it once, you'll probably be able to go right out and duplicate their work real nice. It's not a super high-tech thing, it's just a patience thing getting these right. Now, of course, we still should have, pull off the tape, we still should have our hinge slotting tool for putting the hinge slots in. But before we do the hinge slots, I want to taper some of this down. And I'm going to basically try to do that with the old just knife. Now we're dealing with the grain straight. So this should be a picnic. This stuff should come off like butter. Pretty nice light piece of wood here. And you don't want to go up into the center line now. You want to maintain a little distance from the center line. Now another way to do this that I do on a bigger ship, so I don't want to do it on this, is to run a piece of 1/8" tape along the trailing edge. When I'm building a BJ or a pattern master, I run a tape right up on the edge. That seems to hold a nice 1/8" minimum. You can just radius it right off. We don't want to turn these flaps into paper thin, but we do want to get them that they have a little bit of an airfoil taper in them. You can take a lot of material off at the more at the tip than at the root. You can leave a lot of material up by the horn, in fact. That won't hurt. Make that area strong so you can tweak these without running the risk of chewing it all up. Now it's good to leave the flaps just a little bit oversized anyway, because once we butt this up to the wing, we want to join it up real nice and neat. Now I'm going to try to block sand some of this off. Try and get out of the way of the camera. Lay it up on the table and just block away. Again, I don't want to go right into the center line. I'll use some rough paper on this to start with. Of course, you get a nice shower of sawdust when you do this. Alright, now obviously we'll go back. We've got one side done. We'll go back and sand the other side and then get this back on camera. Now we're finishing this flap up. It's important to get the trailing edges reasonably thin as possible without making it paper thin so it's prone to warp. Blunt leading edges and thick trailing edges eat a tremendous amount of horsepower. Tremendous amount of horsepower eaten up in trailing edges being thick, leading edges being thick. I proved that on my MIG. I had thick trailing edges because of the built-up surfaces. And I made a little triangle and silicone sealed it onto the trailing edge just to sharpen it up. And the whole flight characteristics of the plane changed. Got a lot slipperier. The flight through corners a lot cleaner. So since then, I've been a believer in keeping the trailing edges nice and thin, as reasonably possible. This flap is just about done. I've switched the block over to 320 paper to try to get a final shape on it. Now once this is married up to the back of the wing with the hinges, then the real work begins, is getting it dead level with the hinge line so there's no gap, no lump. That's where you really have to take some time with the block sanding. Now the reason we put the clear dope on the wing already is to stiffen that wood up so we could get a perfect match in on the flaps. You wouldn't have a step or a gap or one side higher than the other. Any of the other inconsistencies. And what I like to do with the hinges on a flap, rather than hot stuff them, is epoxy them in. Then you got time to change your mind. Got about half an hour to change your mind if it doesn't line up exactly perfect. Or you want to, at the last minute, make some changes. Now this flap is pretty much ready to put the hinge gaps in. About a half hour to make that. Looks stayed nice and straight. Stayed nice and straight. We still have a line on there. We could even get back a little bit of that radius off the back of this. And if you're careful and you get good quarter grain wood, and you use this couple of these little techniques, you have to come out with a real light, nice straight true flap. You dope this, it's not going to all twist up on you. cut the notch for that and the hinge gap. First I'm going to sand the other flap and then clean up this mess. The shop's turning into a toilet here. And because I've made the trailing edge really nice and thin, really aerodynamically efficient, I want to right away get some clear dope on that trailing edge to kind of stiffen it up while I'm working on it, so every time I touch it, it doesn't all of a sudden have a ding in it. I don't want to have to repair that. I went to the point where we're putting the hinge pockets in. And the same as we did on the elevators, we have a little plywood tool with a little piece of sandpaper. Does it a real quick operation. And it's only a question of taking it and duplicating it onto the other flap. We also have the little notches built in right in the end for the horn. You can put a little mark on these. Then you'll have your hinge pockets all exactly straight. Of course, you take the heavier flap, put it on the outside, the lighter flap on the inside. I weighed these up. There's a couple grains difference between them. Wood is not exactly the same. Now that does a real neat job, real quick. Zip, boom, bang, go right down the line. You'll get the hinge pockets in. And of course the depth here is controlled by the fact that you make up this little tool and you make it the depth of the hinge barrels. A little Dick Maddox trick. I did this on the elevator tape. Went through this. Okay, we got the first set of hinges is in here with epoxy. We got them shoved in pretty good. And we take a Q-tips, a little bit of lacquer thinner, and get out the extra epoxy, so we don't have a lot of mess in there. Then as the final thing, you take a brand new X-Acto blade and try to make sure the alignment on these hinges is perfect. They tend to get a little cocked when they get shoved in. This one here is real crooked. Okay, here we go. Try to straighten them all out. You can also feel along the hinge line and see if you're getting any crookedness here. This feels pretty good. A little epoxy out of it just makes for a nice neat job. Stick up on you so bad. We also want to check that we got the alignment just right. This hinge line feels pretty good. And we'll trim that flap off later, of course. Now we haven't hot stuffed the horn in here yet. We don't want to hot stuff the horn in until we look down the flap hinge line and make sure the two flaps are dead parallel to each other, because once we lock that in, we're going to be stuck with it. We married it. Okay, looks like we got good deflection on there. Most of the epoxy out of there. Q-tips are real handy for getting that epoxy out of there. Alright, and like I said, then the last step's going to be we'll just shove those hinges into the outside hinge, and then we'll check the alignment on the center section before we go any further. Then we're probably going to let this dry. Let this epoxy harden up and dry real nice. Once it dries, again, make sure these things get crooked when you push them in. We can trim out that flap edge, blend that tip in real nice. Sight down the two flap edges, make sure they're dead level. I've already got several coats of clear on there to firm them up so we can get a true alignment. And we'll be ready to do a final 400 sanding on the wing, couple coats of clear, and cover it. Now the last step on this, I'm putting a piece of 64th plywood. I lined up the two flaps so that the two are equal. Put this little cap of 64th plywood. And we'll put a little cap on this end too. A little notch for the horn. Maybe on a 60 ship you want to put 32nd or 16th. But the idea of having those horns embedded in the end of the flap, you get the minimum weight on the horn, least amount of torsion. Stiffens it up a little bit without adding any weight at all. In fact, it's lighter. This is usually where you hot stuff your hand right to the part. I already have the horn hot stuffed into the end of the flap. This is just going to be to get the 64th plywood cap on there. And what you have to do then is trim it off with a razor blade. I like to take a brand new double-edged razor, block sand it in a little bit. You might even put a little bit of fiberglass cloth around the edge of this. Notice I got the foam pad back on the table while I'm working on this wing. Try to hold it together. You'll glue the hand to the flap trick. And of course the hot stuff in the end of the wood tends to stiffen up the wood a little bit too, so it solves two problems at once. Plus that assembly is really super fuel proof now. It's got a little bit in the hinge gap there. Okay. Okay, we can trim that up with the old brand new X-Acto knife, and that should be it.
And picking out a little bit out of the hinge line there. Alright, you get the idea. We're just going to sand that all, block it all back down. Okay, I'm just trimming in the tips now. Okay, we got that blended in. We'll probably do the same on the other one. The last thing we're going to do before we actually tissue the wing, you have 3 coats of clear dope on here with a little bit of blue tint in it so you can pick up where the extra dope is. And you notice as you're going back and block sand out, usually where the hinges are, you'll pick up high spots. The high spots will show up as raw wood through the blue. Now depending on how fussy you are, these will have to be we'll go back and put another couple of coats of clear on them so that the tissue will stick well. Also, again, we're getting back to basics here, rounding off all the cap strip edges. We're using 320 paper on a block. And you see a lot of little white high spots coming through the blue. That's the reason for using the blue. Now you'd be surprised when something looks perfect and you really want to be fussy, you go back and you can find some little mistakes in it almost every time. Now if you don't do this, you wind up putting 10 coats of filler on to straighten it out. This way you're actually probably saving some weight, because you're also putting a little bit of dope into the grain of the wood. When you use an A-grain wood, that grain really tends to stick up when you clean the plane out in the sun. But if you're real patient, I've gone back on sanding this out 2 or 3 times already. And just before I cover it, I'll go over it again with 320 by hand. I like to use a block on all the cap strip edges. But also I'm picking up the high spots. When you shove the hinge into the wood, you'll see the wood bow out a little bit. After you dope it and shrink it down a little bit. Also like to blend the tips in real good. Clean up the little area where the lead out box comes through. Take care of all the joints. This is the part where you're going to start actually making a decision as to how nice the finish on this strip will be. There is absolutely no shortcut that I know of other than going back over it over and over and over and over with the block, picking out all the bad spots, because every time you wet the wood, the thinner in the wood will swell up the grain of the wood a little bit, and new high spots will show up probably the four or five first times you do this till you get that grain sealed. That's the idea of using penetrating thinner on these first couple of coats, because you can pick them up right away. Also, another thing that's good to do right now is get that leading edge 4 or 5 extra coats of dope, because as the people launch your plane, they'll be putting their fingernails into it and everything. I like to have that nice and tight. Also, another thing is the joints of the sheeting. You can block them out. It's real nice. You can really see a pro job when you go look at it in the sun after the airplane's a year old and you don't see the joints in the wood. It really shows you the extra little patience and love and care that's into that airplane.
Yeah, usually quarter grain wood doesn't have a lot of grain showing through. You don't have to be too crazy about getting it straight. But what we do on this is the hinges will pop right through when you do it this way. Now I'm used to doing it where I put the hinges in later. This is the first one I've done like this in a long time. Like I said, all my latest planes were done, the hinges were installed after they were buffed out. And there's nothing wrong with that, obviously. 2 contourus trophies must mean something's right, but this way is how you built in the old days, and I'd like to keep the tradition of building when I'm building an older plane like this. Just keep the tradition. Just to see if any of these old techniques really are better than the new techniques. Most of the older techniques don't tend to be time-saving, but they tend to be a good investment. And you really can do some nice workmanship when you're dealing with this. You can feel each cap strip, each little piece. Depending on how fussy you want to be. Once you bring them high spots up, then you have to go back over I go back over the whole thing with another coat of clear before we put the tissue on. We'll probably be putting the tissue on tomorrow. I'm going to have company over the house tonight, so probably won't get much done tonight. But it's just a question of how fussy you want to be, how much you're willing to pay. The price of a nice finish you pay in time. Time and effort. And the people who really do the good finishing can spot the little details a mile away. A lot of people can't, they don't know the difference, but somebody that's really a good finisher, I'll bet you Stan Powell or Joe Reinhardt would pick up one of these cap strips and cook it in a minute. Now I nicked this right here before with my watch band, so I'm going to go over this. I put a little DAP on it, I went over that. I find doing this is pretty relaxing. I actually enjoy this part of it a lot. I enjoy this part a lot more than actually putting the ribs in the wing and the building part of it. Because a lot of people don't like the finish, they just want to get it done. And you do take a lot of pride in the work. It's really like doing artwork. You don't see somebody at an easel trying to rush the job through to get it done. They're doing it, they're relaxing, they're enjoying it. And that's probably one of the keys to getting a really awesome finish, is you really have to learn to enjoy it. People that do bodybuilding learn to enjoy the pain of working out with weights, and I guess good builders have to learn to enjoy the pain of sanding. Anyway, I'm going to put another coat of clear on this, redo the sanding on the whole wing again with 320 or 400, and then we'll be ready to tissue it tomorrow. We'll let that dry overnight. We're about ready to put the first coat of silver on these elevators, stabbing elevators. This is where I normally do the spraying. It's in my laundry room, of course. Now all the purpose of this silver is just to show you where the flaws are in the paint. I'm not really looking to make a silver aeroplane out of this yet. This is just a coat. Show us where the flaws are. We're going to wind up sanding this whole coat of silver off with 400. Now you probably think this looked perfect before I put the silver on it. Now that I'm putting the silver on it, it doesn't look perfect anymore. I can see little mistakes here and there. These mistakes really jump out with the silver. You can see some grain in the hinge line. Again, this is a coat of SIG silver. All we're trying to do with this is just pick out the flaws. This will in effect become a coat of sanding sealer. This silver will all get sanded off, and then we'll put a final coat of silver on. This will pick out all the flaws. And I see we still have a couple little bad spots on the ribs. These little spots jump right out when you put the silver on. Now this is a step you might think you can skip, but if you try to skip this, you wind up paying later on. What this coat also lets you do is see if you have enough dope on it. If you see a nice, smooth, aluminum-looking skin, you know you've got enough base coat on here. If this base coat looks all dried out and papery, well then you know you didn't put enough clear on. You can go back right after you sand this out and spray one more coat of clear on. Fill it in. I'm holding this with a pair of vice grips, which is a good way to hold it by the horn. You get a good grip, you don't have to touch it then with your hands. The idea again is you want to spray the whole thing as soon as possible. You don't want to spray one side and not the other. What usually happens then is it'll shrink unequally. I like to get the whole thing sprayed equally and then let it shrink equally. That's a pretty cold day outside, so I turn the heat up in the house. Maybe let this dry out so I can sand it out this way. I can see another thing by doing this is I really should have about one more coat of clear on here. Before I put the next coat of silver on, I'll put the coat of clear on. What I'll do now is any spot I see that really looks dry on this, where I can really see the tissue coming right through the paint, I'll put an extra coat on and let the silver become kind of a filler and a sealer. Since this silver is all going to get sanded off anyway, it won't really matter how much you put on. One thing is for sure, we sure didn't put on too much silver. If anything, this is a little dry relative to how I'd like to see it. the dry spots and try to get the dry spots so we can sand this off. We'll have enough of this material on it to act like a filler. Looks like the bottom is a little drier than the top. I'll put some extra on the wrist pad. I'm just wetting down the tissue equally now that I have all the dope on that I want. Last thing is I wet down the tissue. Now this tissue is all going to go baggy on me now. But when it shrinks up, hopefully it'll shrink up pretty equally. It won't shrink up one side faster than the other. And you can see the silk span's a little baggy on there now. Now I'll put this out on the work table and let it dry up. And that looks like it'll be alright. Now what we're going to try to do is tissue the wing. We'll put some of this on video. We're going to try to do the wing and a flap all in one piece. We've got the wing final sanded out. This is 00 tissue. I'm using very light silk span. I don't think you need anything heavier than that. We want to overlap the center joint. We want to leave enough around the edge that we can pull this tight. Now I'm going to be putting this on wet. Putting this on wet requires that you go a little faster than if you do it dry. So what I'm going to do, I've got the tissue, take a little atomizer and just get it damp. Doesn't have to be soaking wet. I'm going to put dope on. This already has 3 coats of clear dope. A little bit of blue dye in it so we can see where we're sanding through the high spots. We found some high spots real conveniently this way. This dope also has a little bit of penetrating thinner in it, or what a lot of people call retarder. The purpose of the retarder is to slow down the drying of the dope. Give this a little time so you have some working time with your silk span. And when you put the tissue on, you don't want to do the cap strips. You want to do completely around the perimeter, but not the cap strips, so that it'll all shrink up. As the water in there dries, it'll shrink up like a drum. Then when you put your first coat of clear dope on, the dope you already have on the cap strips will seal it up nice and tight for you. We're going to do the flaps and wing in one piece, and then just go out and cut out the hinge line. A little bit of blue dye in here helps. You can put a little bit of blue Sig blue dope in here even, or actually you can put any color in there. Black even's okay. I just happen to have some blue when I mix this up. Use like about a 1-inch brush is a good starting point. You get some practice. Now because we have a little bit of retarder in this will take a little longer to dry than if you did this with a normal 50-50 mix of clear and thinner. It's all Sig light coat, by the way. Nothing but Sig light coat on this wing. If you did some other kind of mixture here, this would be wanting to dry up by now. It would already be dry, and it wouldn't give you much time to pull out the wrinkles, which I hope we're going to buy a little time here now. Now doing this alone is a little bit of a pain. If you have a helper, it's a lot easier.
Again, the tissue is just damp, it's not soaking wet. You don't have to pull this tight like Monacoat, it'll shrink a certain amount once it dries out. And you have to have a little bit of a technique for doing it. Takes a little time to develop the technique. You have these big rounded tips, you're going to wind up with a couple of wrinkles in these tips, which you'll just sand out real easy as you put some dope finish on it, so it'll sand right out. You want to try to get all the wrinkles off the flat spots. No reason to have any wrinkles on the flat spots. Now we do have a few wrinkles going around the tip. That's normal. Very few, if any. In fact, there's none on the leading edge. This is nice. Pat it down nice. See, we're building in a little bit of a wrinkle here. Now, usually it's a good idea to do right around the perimeter of the paper first. That'll keep your middle bay nice and tight. Then you can work out as many wrinkles as you can out of the outside. It'll give you a little time to work with this. A lot of people like to use heavier silk span on the wing. I'm trying to keep the weight of this airplane down. This will chop a little bit of weight off, but again, you'll have to really be careful when you handle this plane. Certainly not going to be a bulletproof wing or anything with this light tissue on it. There's a lot of other ways of doing this. You could try doing it dry one time and then shrinking the paper. A lot of people like to work that way. That's a reasonable way of doing it. This way is the way I prefer. I just get real comfortable using this method. Over the years, having made a lot of built-up wings. Trick is just to get the paper just damp with an atomizer. A Windex bottle, dump out the Windex and put some water in it. And not having it soak. The soak is just going to make the sheeting ripple up on you. Now we're getting one panel. Now we're working again from the middle out. And again, if you were doing a foam wing, you would just not have to worry about the bays. You could do the whole wing this way. You certainly want to overlap the silk span in the middle of the wing. You sure don't want to let it end up at the fuselage. Let it overlap, so in the complete middle of the wing you have double silk span. That'll add a little bit of strength without adding a lot of weight. All the engine vibration that comes through the mounts will wind up going into that area. It'll be a little stiffer than it normally would be, especially if you have a real light wing structure. Kill some of that vibration. On a foam wing, of course, you'd have the middle of the wing fiberglass by now. Looks like we're getting most of the wrinkles out of this. Now the trick for trimming this out is usually a brand new razor blade. Once you use it once or twice, it just seems like you never get those nice clean cuts. The only problem with that right now is I don't have any razor blades. I just looked in inventory, and there are no double-edged razors, so I'm going to have to make do with an old one. And the wingtips are starting to flatten out relatively nice now. Those wrinkles will sand right out, especially with double O. Double O will let you sand that right out like butter. Not to be too concerned. You want to get the minimum amount, but you sure don't have to lose any sleep if you have one or two little wrinkles out in the wingtip. If you're doing normal, nobler wingtips now, you'd have those little areas out there that wanted to shrink up, and you'd have to be pulling the tissue around the corners.
A little more work. Save ourselves a little work by making them carved wingtips. Okay, now we haven't done the cap strips yet until that tissue dries up. We'll let this dry for a couple hours. In fact, we'll do the whole wing before we actually even do the cap strips. When we put that coat of dope on, right now you want to be putting on at least 2, maybe 3 coats of dope right around the edge, just like I'm doing over and over, and let it soak in, let it get a good grip, because the thinner is going down into the dope that's already on the wood and acting like glue and holding this tissue, getting a good bond so that your finish will stick. I'm sure everybody out there has done a finish, pulled up the tape, and seen the paint come up with the tape. And that's what happens when you put this on too dry. Right now you want to get plenty of dope on there. Let that really soak in nice. Hopefully we've got all the rough spots out of this wing. Don't have any problems with that. Tail is in silver already. It's drying out real nice. We'll let this dry out later. I think once anybody does this once or twice, you'll get real comfortable with the technique. You should have no problem at all doing real neat work after 1 or 2 practice tries. In fact, a lot of people do it on the first try. No reason to think the first one won't come out right. And you hope after watching some of these videos, people pick up some little ideas and tricks, save themselves a little bit of disappointment as you try to build nice aeroplanes. Okay, now we just want to cut off the edges of the tissue. What's nice is that bell crank bolt sinks down into this carpet foam. That carpet foam, by the way, is really a handy thing to have around. Anybody's throwing that away, stop your car and run over and pick it up. Around here, being in a flood zone, we get a nice unlimited supply. Every time it rains, people are throwing rugs and carpet foam away. Now, because this isn't a brand new blade, this is not trimming off really slick. If this was a new blade, we'd be in good better shape than we are now. Yeah, I guess it's okay. Obviously, we have to do the hinge line too. Now, one of the ideas about finishing this way is getting the wing and tail in silver before you actually put them in the body. It lets you work on component parts, which is a little bit easier than working on a big airplane, especially if you're working with a limited room like I have in this shop. You don't get it all beat up by the time it's in silver. The silver parts are a little sturdier, and if one of them does warp up on you, you can kind of fix it before it becomes part of the final airplane. And then you're married to it. And I've thrown away quite a few tails and flaps and things that haven't really come out as good as I wanted them to. It really is a pain not having a new razor blade when you do this. And what we'll do as soon as we finish this one bay, we'd like to move right along and do all 4 of these as soon as possible so that one doesn't start to shrink up before the next one gets a chance to do some shrinking. So what's a good idea is to start your silk span job early in the morning so you can get all 4 sides done before you start getting tired and cranky. Before your wife comes down and bothers you or friends start calling on a phone. You just wipe the edge with your bare finger.
Run some of that down in the hinge line. Again, this looks like a reasonable job. This did not come out too bad. Okay, now we'll do the rest of the other 3 bays off camera, but that should give you a little idea of how to get a wing tissued up. Covered. Putting on a second coat of clear just to seal this up before we flip it over. We haven't really attached the tissue to the cap strips yet. And we're going to, as soon as possible, flip this over and do the other side. We don't want to wait. We want to get this all wet and all drying at the same time. That's the name of this game. Same as when you do an I-beamer, you try to do both sides at once. Hey, we have the whole wing covered now, and it's still a little damp. The dope is not really cured out yet. But while everything's damp, upper and lower surfaces, I want to shrink this tissue, put a couple coats of clear dope on it, and then set it aside to dry. The idea is to do the top and the bottom at exactly the same time. This way it'll shrink equally, hopefully keep the warps to a minimum. And this wing is still vulnerable to warps. We're using all light coat, no shrink dope on this wing at all. Since we used all light contest grade wood, this wing is probably not going to be as super strong, say, as it would be if you used all heavier wood. We want to keep the weight of this plane to a minimum. I want to have this plane weigh 42 ounces when it's done. That's what Mr. Gieske seems to think would be an ideal weight. And I guess he knows. If anybody knows about Noblers, I guess he does. But anyway, we want to try to shrink this up and keep checking it for warps. Warps can come back into this at any time. We're working in a damp basement here, and it's really, today it's pouring rain, in fact. Has a tendency to warp up on you. Now what I'll do, I'll put top and bottom, now it's nice and wet. And I'll set this aside to dry for about 4 or 5 hours till this all dries out. Probably going to put about 5 coats of clear on this tissue. And then just like we did on the stab, put extra coats on all the caps before we go on to the next step. I also ran double tissue along the trailing edge of the flaps. These flaps are real nice and thin. Hope that'll keep them from warping up, but we'll find out. Doing the final sanding on the silver. We're trying to get a lot of this silver off, just pick out the high spots. As you work this out, you'll notice though, the shiny silver will stay in the valleys, and they'll pick out all your bad spots for you. Once this silver dries overnight, it'll dust right off real easy too. Now obviously you don't have to get it all off, but it's really going to tell you where your bad spots are, where the worst spots on this are. Now there's a couple of them jumping through here. I'm glad we have this on the video. We can get this cleaned up real nice now. Now again, you have to be real careful in by the silk span. A lot of times with silver you're going to pick up the brush marks
from the clear that you put on the silk span. And when you do that, if you do all the brush lines that way, then you can just sand through the bays and they'll take out the brush marks. This is where having all those extra coats of clear on the rib caps saves you from going through. Hopefully you won't have a problem with that. Hopefully I won't have a problem with that. And if you use 400, you can get most of it right off. And what I'll do with this is, looking at the bad spots, if I don't see any really bad spots, I'll just go over and give this another coat of silver. And we'll be ready to sand this out again. Now while we were waiting for the stab to be made up, I made up a bell crank for my 60 ship, which I'll be starting soon, as soon as the wing comes in from Big Jim. Ground this out of 1/4 inch Delrin, lightened it up with the Dremel tool, put the brass bushing in the center. This is just about ready to mount in the plane. I'll put a little, probably finish this today. I'll put the rod through with the eyelets and everything, just to put this on camera so people can see. This is a 4" by 13/16 pattern master bell crank, and it weighs 10 grams. Now what we did, we soldered the 2 eyelets. The idea of this is not to get the solder near the Delrin. Solder the eyelets far away. It's 3/32 music wire, and there's a little steel bushing in there. And let's see, I want to put a drop of motorcycle chain oil on that before we put it in the airplane. But that's pretty much ready to put in the airplane now. We'll make up the push rod for this later. Again, this is for the 60 ship. I just showed this while I'm making it up. This is not going to be part of the Nobler, for anybody who hasn't made up a bell crank yet. Now this is after our second coat of silver, and obviously the silver shows up all the mistakes. So now we're going to go back over this. This is the second coat of silver. I'm going to sand this all off with 400. There's not too many biggies, but there's a lot of little dry spots on here. What I really did, I should have put one more coat of clear on this with the spray before I went and did the silver. I'm 1 coat short on this. So what I'm going to do is take the 400, sand this all down again, being real careful around the ribs and the edges, and then I'll spray on 1 more coat of silver for today, and then that'll probably be ready to put in the fuse. And we're coming right up on putting the wing in the body here, so it looks like it hasn't warped up at all. Still looks pretty straight. 1 more coat of silver should get this ready. This is a handy way to hold it when you spray it by the horn anyway. Now I'm just taking 400, I'm sanding it dry of course, and just running over all the high spots of the silver. This is probably the single most important step in finding every little mistake in this finish. And if you don't find them now, you're going to find them when you go to paint the plane or buff it out. I always like to do I'll do one elevator on camera. I always like to do the rim first. And I always do the brush strokes in that direction, and then do the sanding strokes in this direction. That gets out all the high spots. Again, you got to really be careful not to go through on these ribs. That's why we put all that extra clear on there. And if you take your time, it's kind of a time-intensive thing to get out all those sanding marks. When you finally do that and you go to buff out the plane, the thing will buff out pretty reasonably.